Hello everybody and welcome back to Spacedock. I'm Hojuana and this week I've been inspired by our recent Independence Day breakdown because it reminded me of just how neat the moon tug in the sequel is. Those big grabby hands it sits on, powerful engines, good visibility. It's a nice craft, and it got me thinking about how underrepresented tugs are in science fiction. In real life, tugs are powerful and maneuverable vessels that are used to guide much larger ships through complicated or delicate waters, like harbours. This is because bigger craft have a lot of inertia, and generally their engines are optimised to get them across longer distances. These two things combined make manoeuvring in tight quarters very challenging, which is where tugs come in, acting as additional engines for the big ship. But does this even apply to spacecraft? The inertia one certainly does, and there's plenty of big ships out there that may struggle with delicate movements, though there aren't really harbours up in space. Many settings also have proper manoeuvring thrusters placed over the craft that may render tugs redundant, the obvious one being the Expanse, but Star Trek has them as well, not that they're used much. The latter one simultaneously makes a case for and against tugs though, as while it seems very common to have spacecraft dock internally on space docks, it's also clear that they're fine with getting themselves in and out of these locations. Is that just for simplicity's sake though? It may be, but it does feel like a missed opportunity to have cool, worker-bee-esque tugs take ships in and out, to avoid those Galaxy Quest situations. Sure, they could do that with tractor beams on the station or ship itself, which has been the case for smaller craft now and then, but that's kinda dull. Stick the tractors on the tugs. Going back to real life, if you think about it, it's not just big ships that need tugs to do these sort of maneuvers. Aircraft need a hand to get around airports because most can't reverse, and those that can really shouldn't be doing it near terminals. So you get these chonky aircraft tugs that come in all sorts of flavours, which can provide some inspiration for sci-fi tugs, or even use them as a basis for another type of vehicle entirely. Another real-world use for tugs is salvage and repair. These are blue water vessels that go out to ships that are in distress to assist, or to salvage ones that have sunk or run aground. These sort of ships show up a lot in Trek, where the vast distances involved in interstellar travel mean having no warp drive is a big deal. Generally, it does seem like any ship with a tractor beam could do this task, but that's a bit of a waste of anything that isn't a tug. X4's Manticore is a pretty cool salvage tug, based around the idea of creating a recycling economy after the sudden closure of the jump gates. When local raw resources are low and you can't import stuff, what else can you really do to keep things running? Thus, the Manticore was made in order to retrieve shipwrecks and such and bring them to stations for processing. This type of tug is also sort of what the Tycho retrieval fleet used when they went and got the Nauvoo back in the Expanse, after it was hurriedly sent off to die, but didn't. They could have just strapped a whole bunch of normal ships to it instead of all these flying engines, but that may have ended up being more challenging to rig up and control. Little tug engines networked together to act as one also looks really cool, and has even been done in Kerbal Space Program. And everyone knows that if it works in KSP, it must be a good idea, right? The thing is, salvage tugs have become used less and less after their heyday around World War II, thanks to a combination of environmental concerns and ever-increasing ship sizes. Emergency tow vessels, or ETVs, have taken their place, and are instead state-run rescue ships that can lend their big honking engines to ships that can't use their own. A salvage tug or privately run ETV seems like it would make for a really cool hero ship, in the same sort of vein as Serenity is. A clearly industrial design that needs a crew to go off on little adventures and odd jobs, either on the level or off the books. And tugs just look so enamoring. A salvage one with cranes and robot arms and all sorts could have custom modifications and stuff that many hero ships end up with. That sort of vibe is already a big part of many belter ships in the Expanse, but none of those vessels really had a hero ship vibe to them. Another real-world uses of tugs is to be the engine for barges, which are basically just floating boxes. You can stick whatever you want in them. They're generally used for low-cost bulk goods, though sometimes they can transport unique objects like supersonic jetliners. Splitting up the engine from the cargo is neat because the tug can be off doing whatever while the barge gets loaded or unloaded. Sometimes there's even special barges with notches in them that a tug docks with, and wait a minute, I know what this is! The cargo stuff could definitely stand to be bigger, but it's clearly the same idea going on here. However, you know that escape pod on the Falcon in Solo? That thing used to be a tug of its own, a little auxiliary craft for YTs that Lando modified, but it's a bit weird? Okay, sure, you can use the little tug to assist with docking the cargo module, but then what? It looks like it gets left behind rather than being taken along for the ride. Seems a bit odd. Another neat example of this is Star Trek's Wallenberg class, which also docks to a cargo module. The thing is basically a detachable warp drive, which is pretty neat. Very much the sort of craft you'd try to scrabble together in a hurry for a sudden evacuation, assuming they have decent warp speed. Just like before, there's also other real-world examples of tugs, but not tugs. The most obvious appears when you just switch things around and have the engine pulling the cargo. Trains are a similar deal, but there's also switches or shunts, which are optimized for short-distance travel and intended to put together train cars ready for a long-ranged optimized locomotive to haul. And these look really cool as well. I don't know if it was intended, but the ships in Nebulous give me the same sort of vibes as switches do. Another option for inspiration. There is another job tugs do, which is haul around oil platforms and get them set up, though usually the ships that do that are considered multi-purpose utility craft, or more specifically, anchor-handling tug supply vessels. We did actually mention a similar craft in our large ships video recently, the Pioneering Spirit, which picked up platforms and carried them around. But anchor-handling tugs definitely fit the bill for tug work, as they tow floating platforms to where they need to go. They also can look cool as hell and extremely utilitarian, especially the ones that have a helipad up front and above the bridge, which is done because the rear deck is used for cargo and stuff. There's even a sort of real-life example in the International Space Station. While yes, it is in space, there's no hard cut-off to the top of the atmosphere, so the ISS is still very slightly impacted by drag, enough that over time its orbit decays down and it needs to be boosted back up, which is usually done by one of the cargo craft attached to it. These are very small compared to the big boys on the seas, but it's the same concept. As for an example in sci-fi, well, there's a really famous one that I can think of right off the bat, Nostromo. It's designed to tow huge industrial equipment around, and well, stations in sci-fi may need the same treatment. Okay, so maybe they could move themselves through dubious methods, or could just go with a lower power engine that takes ages to get anywhere because there's no water friction to deal with. But come on, the big ol' Nostromo has such a vibe, and real anchor handling ships are so damn awesome looking. Why wouldn't you want to work such multi-purpose beasts into a setting or story? It's the same deal as when I suggested Salvage tugs being a hero ship, just potentially on a bigger scale and linked to mining operations instead of salvage. It doesn't even need to be the main ship, just as flavour they'd be super cool to see. So that is tugs in space, an interesting little class of utility ships that I feel are underutilised, which is a shame because they have some great potential. There's plenty of freighters out there in sci-fi, but many other kinds of industrial craft tend to be overlooked, despite the obvious potential for stories and world building. And even if you don't want to use them directly, real-world tugs can provide a great source of inspiration. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our Spacefighter design reference book. Alternatively, you can support us directly through YouTube by giving us super thanks or by becoming a channel member. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.